The first thing we heard was the scream of the wind, and then the thud. A child's wooden arm hit the snow, and an old German shepherd stood over him, trembling, staring into the blizzard like he'd seen a ghost. And then Samuel whispered, voice cracking in the cold, "Dad, they're still alive." Moments earlier, the mountain had been silent, too silent. No birds, no tracks. Just an 8-year-old boy limping through the storm with a dog old enough to have seen more battles than most men. Max's fur was frozen stiff. Samuel's breath shook in broken clouds, both moving toward something they wished they hadn't found. Because before this night, Max had been a hero, a K-9 who carried a dying veteran out of fire and steel. And Samuel, weak, shivering, missing an arm, had always believed heroes survived every battle. Until now. What they found half buried beneath the snow wasn't an accident. 2 officers, bound, blue-lipped, left to die. And the world? No alarms, no rescue coming, no footsteps except the ones circling them in the storm. What happened next would tear open secrets buried for years and reveal who truly guards the light in this world. Before we begin, tap like, share this story, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I'm truly curious how far this light can travel. The morning over Aspen Ridge rose quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that didn't belong to winter, but to something watching beneath it. Snow lay smooth and untouched across the slopes, pale as breath caught in a throat, while the pines stood stiff as sentinels, their branches heavy under the night's fresh fall. There was no wind, no song of sparrows, no soft crack of ice shifting under the sun's early warmth. Instead, the ridge seemed to hold itself still, as if waiting for someone else to make the first move. And long before Samuel Cole appeared between the trees, Max had already sensed the tremor of something wrong in that quiet, the way only an old dog who had carried too many winters inside his bones could. Max moved with the slow, deliberate stride of a warrior whose body remembered battles long after the world forgot them. 12 years of service lived behind his amber eyes. 12 years of smoke, ash, storms, rescues, and the kind of miracles that arrive on 4 legs instead of 2. His coat, once dark and rich, was now brushed with gray around the muzzle and along the spine. Each breath he exhaled hung heavy in the frigid air, and yet there was nothing tired about him this morning. His ears stayed high, twitching, reading the forest like scripture. Every few steps his muscles tightened, not in pain, but in warning, like an old soldier hearing echoes no one else could hear. Samuel Cole followed close behind him, a small figure cut from determination more than strength, wrapped in a blue winter coat patched at the elbows. His black hair peeked from beneath a knitted beanie, catching the light like strands of onyx. He was 8 years old, slight, with narrow shoulders and thin hands tucked into wool mittens. Where his right arm should have been, his father had carved a wooden replacement, smooth oak, sanded carefully, with leather straps cinched across Samuel's chest. It swung when he walked, not like a burden, but like something he had learned to fold into himself. He breathed sharply against the cold, each exhale puffing out like smoke, and he tightened his scarf as he descended the ridge. This daily walk wasn't a routine. It was a lifeline, a rhythm that taught Samuel to trust the mountain again after the accident, and a rhythm that kept Max's aging heart steady and purposeful. They moved like 2 beings stitched together by quiet suffering and stubborn hope. Samuel's pace tried to match Max's. Max slowed just enough for him to keep up. But today, Max didn't set the rhythm. Today, something else did. Halfway down the ridge, Max's entire body went still, so still that the snow falling from a branch above him landed on his back without making him flinch. His paws planted deep into the snow, tail rigid, head lifted as though the air itself had called his name. Samuel instinctively stopped too, chest rising sharply. He had seen Max freeze like that only twice before. Once when he found a wounded hiker, half buried under a landslide, and once when he dragged Samuel's own father, bleeding and delirious, out of wildfire smoke years ago. A low rumble rolled out of Max's chest, deep enough to vibrate the snow around his paws. Samuel swallowed. "What is it, boy?" But Max was already gone. He lunged off the trail so fast Samuel stumbled forward, nearly falling as he scrambled to follow. Branches whipped his coat, snow clutched his boots, and the cold knifed up through the seams. His wooden arm knocked against his torso with every frantic step. The forest narrowed to a tunnel of white, the world shrinking to the sound of Max's urgent bark bouncing between the trees, a sound not of alarm, but of command, demanding Samuel run faster. Then the stillness broke, not with a roar, but with two shapes that should not have been there. Samuel burst into a small hollow carved into the snow, and his feet skidded to a halt. Before him lay a man and a woman, two grown adults partially buried in a drift, their bodies twisted awkwardly as though dropped there like discarded tools. Their faces were blue and rigid, rimmed with frost. Ice had gathered around their eyelashes. Their clothing, heavy-duty winter gear, was frozen stiff, the fabric crusted white. Their wrists were bound, their ankles tied tight. A strip of duct tape sealed each mouth, the edges brittle from the cold. Badges glinted faintly beneath the frost. Police officers, left for the mountain to finish. For a heartbeat, Samuel couldn't move. His breath stuttered in his chest, caught between fear and disbelief. He had never seen a dead body before, not this close, not laid out like broken offerings to the snow. But then he saw it, the faintest puff of white rising from the man's nose, a thin thread of life clinging desperately to the freezing air. They were alive, barely, alive enough for the mountain to still be deciding their fate. Max pressed himself over them immediately, lowering his aging body to shield their torsos from the wind. His fur bristled, but his eyes were steady, purposeful, as if his life had been waiting for this moment. Snow swirled around them in erratic spirals, the forest suddenly tense, as though every tree leaned forward to watch what Samuel would do. He dropped to his knees beside Max, hands trembling as he brushed snow away from the woman's cheek. Her skin felt like porcelain, fragile enough to crack. Her lashes fluttered when Samuel's mitten brushed against them. She was fighting, but losing. A sound rolled through the tree line above them. Thunder, but not from the sky. It was deeper, mechanical, carrying weight and speed. An engine, maybe more than one, moving closer. The snow trembled beneath Samuel's boots, sending vibrations up his legs like a warning. His heartbeat kicked up. Someone was coming. And for a terrible second, he didn't know if it was someone who wanted these officers saved, or someone who wanted them found too, late. Samuel fumbled for the small emergency radio his father insisted he always carry. The plastic felt frozen against his palm as he pressed the button with shaking fingers, shutting Tyrannia. Then another noise. Soft, foreign, a crackle that didn't belong to his father's voice. Samuel tried again. "Dad? Dad, can you hear?" The static shifted, and a voice he did not recognize, low, cold, wrong, slid through the speaker like a blade of ice. "Who's out there?" The forest exhaled, the engine roared nearer, and the quiet morning finally revealed what it had been hiding all along. This was no walk. This was a beginning. The radio hissed in Samuel's hand like a frightened creature, the sound crackling against the rising wind as though the mountain itself were trying to speak through it. He pressed the button again, hoping for the familiar steadiness of his father's voice to break through the static, the voice that had anchored him through hospital nights and quiet terrors in the dark. But instead came the same jagged reply, sharp and impatient, from a man who should not have had access to their frequency at all. The words carried something colder than the snow around them, an edge that made Samuel's small fingers tighten around the radio until his knuckles whitened. He stood frozen, torn between calling again or dropping the device entirely, as if letting go might silence the danger threaded through the air. Max felt the danger before Samuel could understand it. His body shifted, muscles tightening beneath his winter-worn coat as he angled himself toward the tree line. His tail lowered, not in fear, but in warning, the kind that once meant the difference between life and death on battlefields. He no longer walked. A soft growl rippled from him, rolling low and steady, matching the metallic taste that suddenly clung to the air. A taste that didn't belong to snow, but to engines, metal, and the presence of someone close. Samuel swallowed hard, sensing the change even if he couldn't yet name it, and reached instinctively for Max's fur, as if anchoring himself to the only certainty he had. The forest around them seemed to draw tighter, holding its breath. Then the wind arrived. It didn't drift down the canyon as it usually did. It slammed into them, rising from below with a violent sweep that carried old snow, broken needles, and the distant echo of engines climbing far too fast. The sky dimmed as the storm gathered sooner than forecast, folding itself into the hollows of Aspen Ridge like a beast returning home ahead of schedule. Samuel coughed as the gusts slapped against his cheeks, and he turned instinctively to shield the two officers nearly buried in the drift. The woman shivered under her frozen coat, her eyes fluttering, her breath barely visible. The man lay so still that Samuel had to press a mittened hand near his neck to feel even the faintest suggestion of a pulse. Samuel's small hands worked clumsily but urgently as he pulled off his own coat and wrapped it around the woman's shoulders, the fabric stiffening immediately under the frost. Her lips twitched, a fragile sign of life fighting against the cold's merciless grip, and Samuel brushed the ice from her face with trembling fingers. His "Can te go cham ne vao, Max," making a soft thud, and the old dog nudged it gently in return, performing the quiet gesture he always used when courage was more needed than comfort. That familiar touch steadied Samuel's breath, even though fear still clung to him like the winter air. Then the ridge erupted with light. White, blinding, unmistakably human. Floodlamps tore through the swirling snow as several snowmobiles crested the rise above them, their headlights flickering like sparks against the storm's growing fury. Engines roared, sending plumes of ice spraying into the air as the vehicles descended fast and purposeful. At their front was a man Samuel knew by silhouette alone, the broad shoulders, the slow, certain way he dismounted, the boots that sank deep into the snow with the weight of someone who had endured more than most people knew. Raymond Cole, veteran of war zones, wildfire rescue lines, and too many nights holding his son after nightmares, stepped into the clearing with the kind of focus that made even the storm hesitate. Raymond's face was set in a grim line, frost clinging to the short, dark hair at his temples, and his breath burned visibly in the frigid air. Without a word, he dropped to his knees beside the half-buried officers, his hands moving with trained precision, checking vitals, clearing airways, tearing open heat packs with a swift flick of his wrist. His fingers were rough from decades of service, but the way he lifted the woman's head was unexpectedly gentle, like handling something precious he feared might break. Samuel watched him with a quiet ache, noticing for the first time the tremor beneath his father's steadiness, the exhaustion etched deep in the lines near his eyes. Max trotted beside Raymond, head lowered and posture solemn, as if escorting the fallen home. The old dog positioned himself on the opposite side of the woman, shielding her from the wind just as Raymond wrapped her in emergency blankets. Snow swirled thickly around them, clinging to Raymond's jacket, Max's fur, and Samuel's lashes until the world blurred into shades of gray and white. The man beside the woman didn't stir at all, and Raymond pressed 2 fingers to his carotid artery, shoulders tightening as he searched for a pulse that barely existed. His exhale fogged the air, steady but heavy. With practiced urgency, the rescuers slid insulated stretchers from the back of the snowmobiles and secured the officers to them, strapping them in with thick bands so they wouldn't shift during transport. Raymond lifted the woman into the sled himself, snow crackling beneath his boots, and Samuel felt something stir in his chest when he saw how gently his father held her, as if refusing to let the mountain claim one more life. Max stayed close, brushing against the sled as though guiding it. The engines flared, drowning out the earlier silence, just as the storm finally reached full force. Snow clawed across the world in blinding sheets, obscuring the tree line and devouring their footprints the moment they were made. Samuel climbed into the rescue sled beside Max, his small frame shivering not only from the cold, but from the weight of everything he had just witnessed. Max settled beside him, pressing close, his warm breath brushing Samuel's cheek. Inside the cramped sled, the world tightened into a small bubble of dim light, howling wind, and the steady rhythm of Max's heartbeat vibrating beneath Samuel's palm. The woman stirred, her fingers twitching weakly as her hand found Samuel's mitten. The touch startled him, fragile yet desperate, as though she recognized safety in something as small as a child's grip. Her eyes remained closed, fluttering faintly under bruised lids, frost melting along her temple from the heat packs snugged around her neck. Samuel leaned closer, afraid she was slipping away again. Her lips parted, the breath escaping them faint and ragged, nearly lost beneath the storm's roar. Just one breath, one sentence. "They weren't trying to kill us." Her voice cracked, barely audible, each syllable trembling like broken glass. "Not at first." The lights flickered above them as the sled lurched, swaying sharply as the snowmobile hit a ridge of packed ice. Samuel grabbed the side rails, eyes wide, heart pounding at the weight of her whispered words. Max stiffened beside him, ears lifting, body angling toward the back window as though sensing something moving behind the roar of the storm. And then Samuel saw it, or rather, felt it first. A dark shape emerging through the blizzard. Low, large, predatory in its silence. A black SUV, headlights off, following them with a patience that wasn't human. The clinic lights flickered under the strain of the storm, each flutter of brightness stretching shadows across the walls as Raymond carried the officers inside. Snow slid from his jacket in heavy clumps, pooling on the linoleum as he lowered the unconscious man onto a gurney with the practiced gentleness of someone who had done this too many times in too many different wars. Samuel stood near the door, his wooden arm pressed tight against his small chest, watching with wide eyes that absorbed far more than any child should have to. Max stayed close, leaning against Samuel's legs, his warm breath steadying the boy even as the old dog's gaze swept the room with soldier-like precision. Something hung in the air. Not just fear, not just exhaustion, but a truth unfolding too quickly for anyone to control. Inside the clinic, the medic team moved with tight jaws and quiet urgency, their gloved hands working over frostbitten skin and bruised ribs. One medic, a woman in her early 40s with a square jaw and silver-threaded hair tucked beneath a beanie, muttered under her breath as she examined the rope marks carved deep into the officer's wrists. Another medic, a younger man with sunken eyes and the expression of someone used to bad nights, shook his head slowly as he listened to the officer's weak breathing. The storm rattled the windows, pressing the cold against the glass like an unwelcome witness. Someone had meant for these officers to disappear between the storms, to vanish without echo or search. Every injury on their bodies whispered that chilling intent. Max paced the clinic with heavy, deliberate steps, the pads of his paws leaving faint, wet prints across the floor. His tail stayed low, swaying in a way that spoke not of fear but of calculation, as if he was reading the room the way he once read burning structures and battlefield debris. He sniffed every corner, every dragged-in snow trail, every boot print left behind, memorizing what belonged and what didn't. His breathing grew shallow, focused, the way it did when he caught the faintest scent of danger drifting through a broken window or a collapsed beam. The medics barely noticed him, but Samuel followed Max's movement like a second shadow, sensing that the dog was seeing something none of them yet understood. And then Max stopped. So suddenly the silence in the room seemed to tilt. His head lowered, his ears locked forward, his shoulders stiffened, a silent alarm stronger than any bark. Samuel's gaze traced the line of Max's focus. Near the back door, half hidden beneath a smear of muddy mop water, was a single footprint. Clean, sharp, far too recent. The storm had sealed the clinic doors hours ago, frosting every window, freezing every latch. No one should have entered. No one could have. Except through that door, the one now hanging ever so slightly ajar. Samuel's breath hitched, and he looked up, ready to call for his father. But Raymond was already beside him, drawn not by Samuel's expression, but by Max's unwavering instinct. Raymond crouched slowly, the weight in his joints betraying fatigue, yet his mind sharpening with each passing second. He examined the footprint, the crisp tread pattern, the depth carved into the wet tile, the direction of the step. His face hardened, the subtle shift in his jawline signaling a truth he didn't speak aloud. Someone had been here, recently, close enough to touch the back door, close enough to silence the officers if they had woken too soon, not to help them, but to finish what the storm had not. Hours later, when the storm crushed the power lines and forced everyone to abandon the clinic for the old ranger outpost up the mountain, that truth followed them like a bitter wind. The world outside was a blinding white chaos, snow clawing sideways, wind screaming through the pines like something furious and ancient. Raymond led the group through the storm with Max trotting ahead, nose low, posture rigid, guarding every step Samuel took. The ranger outpost, a squat wooden building with shuttered windows and smoke stains from decades of use, creaked beneath the storm's weight as they settled inside. Lantern light flickered along the wooden walls, stretching long shadows that swayed with each flicker of the flame. Someone had placed the two officers near the old cast-iron stove, wrapping them in thick warming blankets until their breaths steadied into weak but consistent rhythms. The outpost smelled of old pine, wet wool, and iron, the scent of survival after too many winters. Samuel sat close to the stove. Max curled around him like a protective shield. the dog's fur radiating a warmth that battled the cold slipping through the floorboards. Raymond paced near the dark window, his silhouette stark against the lantern glow, shoulders tight with worry and something heavier, a guilt that clung to him like soot from a wildfire. His breath fogged the glass each time he glanced outside, searching for movement in the swirling white. Samuel watched him from the floor, head tilted, recognizing that expression even if he didn't yet understand it. It was the same look Raymond had worn after the accident, the look of a man who believed he should have done more, even when he had done all he could. A rustle broke through the quiet, sharp enough to make Max lift his head. The woman, the injured officer, stirred beneath her blankets. Her eyelids fluttered open in a weak, shaky dance, revealing eyes clouded with pain, fear, and memories trying to surface through the fog in her mind. She didn't open them fully, just enough to see Raymond's shape standing near the window. Just enough for recognition to crack through her exhaustion. Her hand, trembling and pale, lifted slightly from the blanket, searching for something to anchor to. Raymond turned at the noise, kneeling beside her in a fluid motion, his voice low but steady as he urged her not to strain herself. She didn't speak a warning. She didn't speak a name. Her lips parted, a raw breath slipping between them as she struggled to form words through the rasp in her throat. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, stranger and heavier than Samuel expected, carrying the weight of fear, betrayal, and a truth sharpened by the cold. Your brother knows. The lantern flickered violently, shadows jumping across the walls like startled birds. Raymond froze, the words sinking into his chest with a thud Samuel could almost feel from across the room. The wind outside howled harder, shaking the shutters as if something, or someone, was pushing against them, trying to get in. Max rose abruptly, hackles lifting like bristling wire, his body angled toward the door with a growl forming deep in his chest. Samuel leaned forward, heart dropping into silence, because Max wasn't staring at nothing. He was staring at someone, or something, moving in the snow dark outside. Morning arrived with a harsh quiet, the kind that doesn't warn of danger but settles after it, heavy and uninvited, like ash after a distant fire. Raymond stood in the open doorway of the ranger outpost, snow piled up to his knees, his breath rising in slow clouds that dissolved too quickly into the pale air. He looked older in this light, not in years, but in the weight of everything he carried. The storm, the officers, the footprint at the clinic, and the woman's whisper that had broken something he had tried so hard to keep sealed. His hands stayed in fists at his sides, knuckles white beneath worn gloves. Behind him, the outpost creaked, and the world felt suspended between storm and silence. Samuel joined him, carefully stepping into the snow, Max brushing against his legs as if choosing to stand between the boy and every shadow the forest knew how to hold. The boy's breath fogged into the morning air as his gaze drifted toward the northern timberline, the place where the officers had been found frozen under the drift. Fresh snow covered most of the night's chaos, but some tracks remained, lines of compression, grooves, and broken crusts pointing deeper into the forest. Samuel saw the SUV tracks first, the unmistakable arcs cutting toward the pines, but something else lingered there too. Boot prints, faint, but sharp enough to hold intention. Raymond followed Samuel's line of sight, and the tension in his shoulders hardened. Whoever had been watching them at the clinic hadn't finished. Whoever had followed their sled through the storm had walked these woods with purpose. The wind moved across their faces, cold enough to sting, But Raymond didn't tell Samuel to go back inside. He didn't send him toward warmth or cocoa or the fragile sanctuary of childhood he had tried so hard to protect. Because Samuel didn't shrink from the cold. He leaned into it, carrying the quiet courage of a child who had survived more than most grown men. Max took a step forward, tail stiff, ears pivoting sharply, his posture alert with the memory of old battlefields. Snowflakes gathered along his spine, but he didn't shake them off. He waited for Raymond's signal, the one that still lived in him from the days when Raymond's voice was command, safety, and purpose. Raymond exhaled, then nodded once. They followed the tracks into the forest, the world muffled under the weight of fresh snow. Pines stood in tall ranks, their branches bowed with ice, letting only thin sheets of light pass through. Max led the way, his stride steady, his paws sinking deep but never faltering, as though something unseen was pulling him along a path he already knew. Samuel walked in his father's footprints, each step careful, each breath uneven but determined. The forest smelled of cold sap, rust, and something else, something metallic that did not belong. Just before the creek bend, the trees opened into a hollow, a place carved out by years of wind and forgotten use. The snow there lay uneven, slumped in patches that hinted at structures buried beneath. In the middle stood an old lumber shed, its ribs broken, roof sagging under the weight of winter. Boards leaned crookedly, nails rusted, windows long shattered into jagged mouths. The shed exhaled cold like an animal hiding its wounds, and the air around it felt heavier than the rest of the forest. Snow slipped through the broken rafters in lazy spirals. Rusted saws and machinery sat like half-buried bones beneath the drift, their edges dulled by time. The place felt abandoned years before Samuel was born, and yet it didn't feel empty. The real wrongness lay by the doorway, a smear of red, thin, sharp, half-buried beneath the snow. Samuel's breath hitched, a small sound swallowed quickly by the hollow air. Raymond crouched and brushed the snow aside with gloved fingers until a full boot print emerged, clearer than any they had seen that morning. The tread pattern was distinctive, deep and heavy, made by someone larger than Raymond, someone who moved confidently through uneven ground. It didn't match Raymond's. It didn't match Samuel's. Max growled, low, steady, and filled with a memory that didn't belong to this mountain. His hackles rose, his nose hovered above the print, and he inhaled with the long, searching pull of a dog recalling a scent carved into the deepest part of him. His growl shifted, deepened, a sound he hadn't made since the wildfire years, when betrayal had walked beside them wearing a familiar face, as if Max had smelled this scent before, long ago, on someone Raymond once trusted. Raymond's jaw tightened, the breath he released turning into a heavy cloud in front of him. His eyes lingered on the boot print longer than necessary, as if searching for a truth he feared to find. Then he stood and walked toward the shed, pushing the warped door open with his shoulder. The hinges complained loudly, echoing through the hollow like a cry. Inside, the cold was sharper, biting. Broken boards littered the ground. A metal table sagged to one side. Papers, frozen, curled, dirty, covered the floor like shed skin. Samuel followed Raymond inside, his wooden arm brushing against the doorframe with a soft knock. Max stayed at the entrance, standing guard, his breath hot against the cold air. Raymond lifted an old crate lid with his boot, revealing shipping logs, some printed, some handwritten, all stamped with dates that made no sense. Forged manifests lay scattered beneath them, cargo weights that didn't align, routes that circled back on themselves, deliveries never recorded anywhere but here. On the wall, pinned beneath a rusted nail, hung a map. Lines drawn in red ink cut across counties, crossing rivers and highways, all converging on one name, a company tied to a small town 2 hours away, a town where Raymond's estranged brother lived. Samuel lifted a broken clipboard from the floor, his wooden fingers trembling slightly as he brushed frost from its surface. Beneath the cracked plastic sheet was a page that listed deliveries to locations no longer standing. Factories long closed, warehouses condemned, addresses swallowed by the forest. He handed it to his father silently, watching the way Raymond's eyes darkened as he read. The veteran, a man shaped by storms and smoke, lowered himself to a crouch, the weight of realization bowing his shoulders. For a long moment, he didn't speak, only breathed through the cold, his hand tightening around the clipboard. Then, in a voice softer than the falling snow, he whispered the sentence that chilled Samuel deeper than the blizzard ever could. "My father died trying to stop something like this." The shed creaked, a long, mournful sound that crawled across the rafters like a warning. Outside, Max snapped his head toward the tree line, body rigid, tail straight, ears slicing the air. His growl returned, sharper this time, vibrating through the wooden doorway. Snow fell from a high branch outside, not from wind, but from the weight of someone stepping back into hiding. Dusk pressed against the hollow, like a breath held too long, dense and unmoving, as if the forest itself understood that what waited in the fading light required stillness. The lantern inside the broken shed cast trembling gold across warped walls, illuminating forged manifests, half-frozen maps, and the worry carved into Raymond's face as he photographed every piece of evidence. Samuel lingered near the doorway beside Max, the boy's wooden arm tucked against his side, his eyes shifting between his father and the dark timberline beyond. Max's stance never changed. Tail low, ears lifted sharply, head tilted with that unwavering attention that belonged to a soldier who had learned to sense danger before it was spoken. Snow hissed softly against the collapsed roof, each flake sounding like a warning landing lightly on wood. Then a figure emerged through the snow, tall, broad-shouldered, familiar enough that Samuel's stomach twisted before he even knew the name. Luke Cole stepped into the lantern radius, Raymond's older brother, a man shaped by hard years and harder silences. His face was gaunt in the cold, cheeks hollowed by sleepless nights, stubble sharp along his jaw like frost-bitten steel. He wore a heavy brown coat unzipped at the collar, revealing a flannel shirt damp from melting snow, and his gloved hand held a pistol loosely at his side. Not aimed, but not lowered. An unspoken admission of how deeply he was entangled in whatever darkness had led him here. His breath smoked in the air, uneven and strained, the kind of breath that belonged to a man carrying more guilt than truth. Raymond stepped forward instinctively, Max glued to his leg, the dog's growl low and visceral, vibrating through the hollow. The two brothers faced one another with a history so heavy it hung in the cold like a third presence. Unspoken grudges, buried grief, miles of distance created by choices neither could undo. Luke didn't speak at first. He didn't have to. The guilt in his eyes spoke before any words formed, a flicker of shame cracking through the frost. When he finally forced words through the cold, they came haltingly. Each sentence weighted like stone. Mercer's men had come to him months ago. They came with contracts that hid threats beneath fine print. They came with pressure masked as opportunity, tapping at a man's pride and debts until he mistook desperation for a path forward. And Luke, drowning under bills, under a lifetime of feeling second to Raymond, under a need to prove he could stand on his own, had signed one of those papers, believing he could stay on the edges of Mercer's criminal machinery without being pulled into the center. But Mercer didn't allow exits. Mercer didn't forgive hesitation. Luke swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw tightening. He told them he had tried to back out, quietly, a few months ago, when he learned what Mercer was actually moving through rural routes, the drugs, the stolen weapons, the smuggling lines disguised as lumber shipments. But Mercer had laughed, a hollow, brutal sound, and had made clear what happened to men who tried to walk away. "No one leaves," Luke whispered, voice cracking. "Not without being buried in paperwork or in the ground." And last night, when Mercer learned the officers had survived the mountain, he sent men to finish the loose ends. Luke's eyes squeezed shut for a moment, grief breaking through. He had followed the men through the storm, not to help them, but to stop them, to undo what he had allowed, to try too late to be someone better than the man Mercer believed he owned. He lifted a trembling hand toward the hollow, gesturing to the forged documents scattered around Raymond's boots. He said Mercer planned to burn everything before dawn, to erase the roots, the signatures, the dates, every piece of evidence that could bring him down. And then Luke spoke of their father, the man both brothers had loved in different, broken ways, and how the memory of him had become a weight Luke could no longer carry in silence. How he could hear their father's voice in every gust of wind, disappointed, asking why Luke had chosen pride over truth. Finally, Luke stepped closer, lowering his pistol until it hung uselessly by his thigh. The lantern light softened the harsh lines in his face, revealing the boy he once was, the one who followed Raymond everywhere, the one who believed his older brother walked on trails no darkness could touch. Luke's voice wavered, raw as exposed bone, when he whispered, "I don't want to lose you the way we lost him." Before Raymond could answer, the hollow erupted. Headlights blasted across the yard, turning the snow into molten silver. The growl of engines shattered the stillness, and black SUVs tore out from behind the pines, their tires churning ice into wild spirals. Doors flew open as armed men spilled out, rifles raised, moving with the rigid, confident efficiency of those who had executed violence many times before. Max lunged forward, pushing Samuel behind a stack of fallen logs, his body coiled like a drawn bowstring, eyes blazing with a fury that age could not tame. Samuel clung to Max's fur, heart pounding so hard it felt like part of the storm. And Luke, a man who had once walked away from every good thing he'd ever been given, stepped forward. He planted himself between his brother and the men who owned his fear, lifting his pistol not with hesitation, but with a clarity sharpened by months of regret. The snow swirled around him like smoke from an old battlefield as he took his stance. His voice, steady at last, cut through the cold with the force of a vow. "It ends tonight." The yard exploded into chaos. Spotlights ignited the snow. Shouts cracked like thunder, and from the tree line behind the SUVs, shapes surged through the storm. Federal agents, armed and advancing, rifles pointed low in controlled formation. Orders barked through the air, slicing through the tension with a precision that left no room for confusion. The armed men froze, startled by the ambush, and within seconds the hollow turned from battleground to arrest scene. Mercer, bald, thick-built, wrapped in a coat too expensive for the work he did, was dragged out from the back seat of one SUV. His wrists were cuffed, his coat torn from the struggle, his mouth twisted in the furious snarl of a man whose empire had finally cracked open in the snow. Luke dropped his pistol, fell to his knees, not in defeat, but in release. Raymond reached him in 3 steps, hand closing around Luke's shoulder, not to restrain, but to steady. Max nudged Samuel's shoulder, his tail sweeping slowly, sensing the shift from danger toward something gentler, something that felt like dawn breaking through a long night. A federal agent approached Raymond, tall, weathered, with a badge glinting under his parka and a sealed file clutched in his gloved hand. His voice was low when he spoke, conscious of Samuel's presence, careful with the truth he carried. Inside the file was proof, signatures, transmissions, logs, showing that someone inside the agency had tipped Mercer off months ago, protected him, fed him locations. And the signature belonged to the man whose cold voice Samuel had heard over the radio the night of the rescue. Wrongdoings reach far, but so does truth. Winter light pooled across the courthouse steps like something newly polished, cold but honest, carrying the weight of weeks spent carving truth out of shadow. The air was crisp, the sky a faded silver stretched thin above the town, and every footstep sounded louder than it should, as though justice itself had a sound when finally delivered. Raymond stood near the bottom of the staircase, hands tucked into the pockets of his worn coat, watching reporters scatter like startled crows when the courtroom doors opened. Luke followed moments later, shoulders tense but eyes steady, his breath curling upward in a slow release, neither victory nor defeat. The law had taken its time, but the gavel had fallen with certainty. Justice arrived, not with noise, but with finality. Mercer was given life without parole, his plea falling flat against evidence stacked by his own greed. His officials and accomplices received decades behind bars, each sentence a stone returning to the mountain it had rolled from. Luke, granted leniency for cooperation, had chosen to testify anyway, choosing truth over comfort, redemption over silence, light over the long corridors of shame. Inside the courtroom, Samuel sat watching from the gallery bench, Max's broad head resting against his knee. The old dog's eyes reflected every ounce of loyalty he had carried up the mountain and through the storm, as if he too understood what justice meant in the quiet aftermath. But the truest moment came days later, wrapped not in applause or headlines, but in the warm hush of the county hospital, a place whose walls carried more whispered prayers than any church in the county. Afternoon light drifted through half-open blinds, settling over the white sheets of a man who had once been the backbone of every lesson Raymond and Luke ever learned. Their father lay propped against thin pillows, his breaths shallow but steady, his eyes sharp with a recognition that pierced years of distance and regret. Raymond stood on the left side of the bed, weathered hands gripping the rail not out of fear, but out of reverence. Luke stood on the right, shoulders slumped under the weight of truth finally spoken aloud. Samuel waited at the foot of the bed, his wool coat still buttoned, as if afraid moving too much might fracture the fragile peace in the room. Max sat tall beside him, chest broad, ears lifted, the posture of a veteran reporting for a final roll call. The old man lifted a trembling hand toward his sons, the movement slow but deliberate, as though he wanted to hold both of them in the same reach. His voice, thin but sure, threaded through the room like a blessing stitched into winter air. "Guard the light, both of you." Something shifted then. Not the machines, not the snow melting on the windowsill, but the weight both brothers had carried for years finally easing. A quiet forgiveness settled over them, undeserved but freely given, softening the harsh lines life had carved into their faces. Raymond exhaled with the kind of relief that reaches bone. Luke's eyes glistened, not from shame this time, but from the slow warmth of a burden set down at last. Days later, the ranger outpost welcomed them back like an old friend. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, lanterns glowed in the thick rafters, and townsfolk crowded the long hall, bundled in wool and flannel against the cold. A commendation banner hung above the hearth. Bold letters painted by the local schoolchildren, uneven but full of heart. The room hummed with the kind of energy only small towns knew. Quiet pride, shared survival, gratitude spoken through presence instead of words. Samuel stood beside Max at the front of the hall, wearing a wool coat slightly too big for him, sleeves brushing the tops of his mittens. His wooden arm peeked from under the fabric, polished smooth from years of use, catching the firelight in a warm sheen. Max sat proudly by his side, tail sweeping slow arcs across the wooden floor, head lifted with a dignity belonging to an animal who had seen storms and chosen courage every single time. They called Samuel forward first. The applause was soft but full, rising from people who understood loss, survival, and the small miracles that return us to hope. The ranger chief, a tall, weather-worn woman with deep-set, kind eyes, placed a patch in Samuel's hand, embroidered with a mountain, a lantern, and a star. "For bravery," she said, voice low but carrying, "for courage that found life where death had been left to settle." Then they called Max. The hall erupted with a warmth that melted through the walls, a cheer that wasn't loud but was deep, rising from hearts that knew loyalty when they saw it. Max stepped forward with the grace of an old warrior, accepting the ribbon draped across his neck with a solemn dignity that made several in the crowd touch their chests. Samuel wrapped his arms around him, burying his face in the dog's fur, breathing in the familiar scent of pine, cold, and something that felt like home. Later, when the fire burned low and the stars emerged like silver pinpricks in a cold sky, the family hiked up to the overlook above Aspen Ridge. Snow stretched below them like an ocean of memories, drifting across the forest tops and valley floor with a gentleness winter rarely allowed. The sunrise painted the world in soft hues of gold and blush, each ray carving warmth into the cold landscape. Samuel stood between his father and his uncle, his wooden hand resting lightly at his side, Max leaning against his knee as though anchoring the boy to the earth. The cold brushed their faces, but none of them flinched. They had walked through worse storms and come out with pieces of light they refused to relinquish. For a moment, a long, silent, healing moment, the world felt forgiven. Not perfect, not fixed, but forgiven. Because sometimes the miracles that save us are not loud. Sometimes they are an old dog refusing to leave. Sometimes they are a child brave enough to follow through the dark. Sometimes they are a father who still believes light can be guarded, even in the coldest winter. And sometimes, when the world softens just enough, they are all three standing together on a ridge made of memory, letting the dawn wash the past clean. Some stories don't end when the mission does. Some simply settle into the quiet places of our hearts, where courage leaves its echo long after the snow has melted. And as we step away from this tale, there is a softness in the silence. Like the world itself pauses to honor those who walk through the cold, so others don't have to. Loyalty. It rarely announces itself. It shows up in the steady heartbeat of an old dog, in the trembling hand of a child who keeps moving forward, in a father who refuses to let the darkness win. These are not grand gestures meant to be applauded. They are small, steadfast choices, made in moments when no one is watching, that become the light we follow without even realizing it. And courage, the real kind, often looks nothing like the stories we're told. It is quiet, patient, sometimes carried by those who have already been broken once, yet still choose to protect someone else. Tonight, as the last ember fades and the ridge grows still again, may we remember that kindness is its own kind of strength, and that somewhere out there, in towns no map bothers to name, people like these still rise before the dawn, carrying a light they never claim as their own. Sometimes, the quietest hearts carry the loudest courage, and sometimes that is enough to keep the whole world warm.